Welcome, everyone, to the Montessori Family Life webinar series. I'm Lorna McGrath, and I'm your host. I'm so glad that you are here today. If you are returning to the webinars, great. Tell your friends about it. Bring them all on. If you are new, we're glad that you've joined us today. So, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. Scott Osborne is with us, and she is the president of the Gulf Coast chapter of UN Women USA. She is also on the national board of UN Women USA. She is a public speaker and often speaks about gender equality and similar topics that are all part of what the UN is promoting for women around the world. And so that's a very cool thing. She is a lawyer. She is a certified Montessori teacher, and she is an international development professional. And here's my favorite part. And she's lived in 7 countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe. So welcome today, Scott. I've known Scott for quite a few years. She taught at Newgate School for many years, and her daughters went to our school, to Newgate School. So we're so glad to have a friend back on the air who knows so much about so many things, and we're excited about your topic today, which is parenting toward gender equality.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Jonathan Wolf with us today. Tim Selden with us today, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So, Scott, do you want to get us rolling now?
Sure. So, and thank you, Lorna. Yes, and I was delighted to teach in the Montessori school as well as a number of other things I've done, and I've sort of grown into a gender equity advocate. It's funny, it's not something I started with, but I often say, as I move through the world at work and doing things, you just keep discovering these issues and realize that they need attention. And the second thing I will say to start is gender equity is not just a women's issue. It tends to get pigeonholed as this thing that women should care about, but it's not. It's across genders. So we'll see as we talk about what sort of we see boys and girls doing. So I guess I'd like to start and say what we see, what some of the stereotypes and things. And many parents think that they are not following stereotypical gender training with their children, or they're very sort of gender neutral, but amazingly, you still see behaviors and language show up in children that reveal gender stereotypes. They are picking it up. They're picking it up from parents, from teachers, from the media, from peers all over. So we see children do 2 things predominantly. The first is to sort of box themselves in. This is what girls should do or say or dress, or this is what boys should do or play with, or how they should function. And the other one we see a lot in children of all ages is a bias toward any children who step outside that box. So, for example, boys who are very effeminate are still teased. We still see that. It's not something of past generations. So you do see girls who at a certain age will hew toward only certain types of play activities. You'll see them talk about themselves in ways that reveal very, very, I would say, old-fashioned traditional feminine things. So we see these stereotypes showing up all over, even though Montessori schools are very gender neutral, I would say, by their design of their environment. You still see these children's behavior and language revealing some amazing stereotypes. I can tell you a little bit about why this is important if you want me to go into that, because I think that's probably the next step. Many parents think it's a little sort of benign. Their daughter likes pink and their boy likes trucks and all these sort of stereotypical things. And of course, there's nothing wrong with a girl liking pink or a boy liking trucks. But when they tend to box themselves in, when they pick up language and behaviors and models of behavior that say, this is what you do, that really changes the notion of supporting a child as an individual. And I think as Montessorians, we prize that so highly, that we want to support a child's individuality. And we don't realize that we put this whole box of behaviors and attitudes on top of them, often unwittingly. I would rarely talk to parents or teachers or grandparents who do it consciously. Occasionally you will, but rarely, but it's unwitting. But we are still putting them in boxes, would say, yes, be an individual, develop at your own pace, be interested in what you're interested in. But in reality, because of gender overlays, we're really saying, here's your acceptable box and here's your acceptable box. And I think that's where the harm comes in.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely very limiting to children, to all of us. Certainly all of us that are on this panel today, I'm sure, grew up with gender stereotypes for ourselves and have had in our adult lives to work on some of those things just so we could function differently in this world. Because I know in my head, there were lots of things about being a girl and being too young. There was another thing they used to do a lot with me, although I knew it had to do with being a girl. They would say, well, you're too young, but it really meant you're a girl, and things like that. And I had a lot of boy cousins, and so I didn't get to do the camping trips and the fishing trips and things like that because that wasn't, the girls weren't allowed to do that, but I'm an old lady, but I know, Scott, that it's true today because in classrooms, I've experienced it with children today, boys and girls. And I think you're right about the boys. I think that boys are more and more being gender stereotyped by media. Media advertises you've got to look a certain way, you've got to be a certain way. And kids these days are seeing a lot of stuff on their phones, on their iPads, on their computers, whatever they've got. So I think this is such an important issue for people personally, but I also think it's a really important issue when people grow up and get into careers, because still many careers either are closed to women or women get a different pay than men for the same jobs. And I think that's all affects all of us. So.
Yeah, the things we see as adults, again, as Montessorians, we should know we have to back them up into how are we getting those into kids as children? That's where it's coming from. So I sometimes tell people the example, men are sort of stereotypically perhaps less emotional, and you'll have women who say, oh, my husband, you can't talk about these topics. And, you'll have people sort of anecdotally joke about men who really aren't in touch with their emotions. We know statistically men commit suicide more. I mean, there's a lot of indicators about that. And you say, well, wait a minute, where is this starting? Where are they getting this? This doesn't have to be. Nobody says, hey, don't really be in touch with your emotions. Don't talk about feelings. But you know what? They're getting it early on as training of what it means to be a boy. So if we're aware of that, and the adults we know, the men we know around us, think, where is that coming from? And that's not helping them. I mean, I would hope that many men today would realize, that's something that they've inherited, but they probably don't want, and we can change the next generations coming along.
Yeah. It reminds me of a great book for children. It's not a new book. I think it actually came out probably in the 70s, because there was a big push in the 70s about language and gender language. And I remember I had a parent, I was a young Montessori teacher, and I had a parent come in to me and she said, Lorna, you really need to be careful about saying things like postal worker instead of mailman. And there were quite a few of those kinds of words that we always just use that were very gender specific. And she said, no, you can't do that. And so I believe this book came out around the same time that I was involved with that teaching up in Connecticut. It's called William's Doll. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. It's a great book, and it's still today is a great book. And it's about a little boy who wanted a doll, and his dad said, no, can't have one. and the boy kept asking for it, over time. He kept saying, but I want a doll. And the father kept saying, no, you can't have one. And finally, I'll tell you the ending of the book, but it's a great book, people. If you want to go out and buy it, it's a really good book. The grandmother buys William a doll.
Nice.
And the father goes to the grandmother and says, why? Why did you give him a doll? I've told him he can't have one. She said, so he can grow up and be a great dad like you. And it's just a wonderful book about that kind of stereotyping and stuff. So, yeah, we
Hey,
learned
just
very
on
young.
I can say one other thing on language. And again, we have shifted pretty well into, postal worker. Sometimes not, but police as opposed to policeman. But a couple that we still hear is it's become very routine that people adults refer to groups as guys. Hey guys, let's do this. Hey, that is not a gender neutral word. The other one that we hear, especially in schools or with groups of children, is boys and girls. Hey, boys and girls. And you might think, what's the big deal? They happen to be boys and girls. But what we're doing is emphasizing gender when it's not important. It makes no difference. That's a group of children, And what we're saying is gender is important. We're constantly waving that flag. And it's constantly saying to children, that's the most important thing. We would never think of doing that when it came to race in this day and age, but we think it's acceptable to segregate boys and girls. And that says to them constantly, inadvertently, this is what's important. I'm a boy, I'm a girl. I'm not a child, I'm a boy or a girl. And you hear that, inadvertently, parents, teachers, coaches, boys and girls. It's just seems like part of our parlance. And I encourage people to not refer to gender when it really isn't pertinent. It's probably only pertinent with your doctor, maybe, It's really not. It's not necessarily what matters to be fully human, I can say, hey, Jonathan looks a certain way. It makes no difference. I'm chatting with Jonathan or I'm chatting with Lauren, if you think about it that way. It's not the most important thing to tell children, here's what matters to you. And yet we do that.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm going to talk again, but then maybe get Margot and Jonathan want to say something. I have a little wonderful grandson, and his name is Otis, and he is 4 years old, just 4 years old, and he started Montessori school last fall. And Otis has the most beautiful blonde, curly hair that I've ever seen, but I am a little biased on that subject. But anyways, and he has never had a haircut in his life. And his hair is very long and very curly. And when he goes to school, his mother ties it back so it doesn't get all in his way, but that's the only reason. But she does, she ties it back. And he's in a Montessori school. Did I mention that? He's in a Montessori school. And there is at least one boy in his class that has sort of called him out on having long hair. Why do you have that long hair? That's for girls. You shouldn't have long hair like that. Now, this is in a Montessori school, and he loves his hair. He's told his parents, I don't want a haircut. I like my hair. And so it's interesting. So it does happen here and now, and
Totally.
even in Montessori schools.
Oh yeah.
So, anybody else want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I have a sort of a similar success story. My oldest daughter, Julie, when her first son was, my grandson was, I think, maybe 7 or 8, he decided to paint his toenails, and this is back in the 80s. And I watched this, and it was funny, the thoughts in my mind. On the one hand, it was like, good for you, Julie, just letting him express himself. And of course, the other thought was a trepidation, like, how are his friends going to treat him when he goes out into the public school life? But he learned through his mother, stand up for yourself. If you want to paint your toenails, it doesn't mean you're any less of an anything as a human being. And I was just so proud of Julie, my daughter, for letting him express himself that way. And I think she did some preparatory conversations with him about, now you may get some pushback from some of your friends. How are you going to handle it? So she prepared him for the societal judgmental, boxing in. But I thought she handled it really well.
That preparation is real important, yeah, because kids need to know, because otherwise, of course, they're getting a different message from home and from school. So to prepare them to handle that is key.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one that can tag on to that. And then Margot, sorry, Margot. When Brendan, this is my son, Brendan, when he was 5 years old, 4 or 5, it was getting to be Halloween time of the year. And so I asked him what he wanted to be, because we had to make a costume. And he said, I want to be a witch. I said, great, that's a good thing to be. Of course, we'll get you ready to be a witch. And Larry, my husband, said, you sure it's okay for him to be a witch? And I said, well, yeah, of course it's okay for him to be a witch. And Larry thought about it some more. I mean, this kind of went on for a little while. And finally, we got really close to Halloween. And Larry said, Lorna, I really think I need to tell Brendan that witches are generally female and that warlocks are generally male, because somebody might, say something about him being a witch, and he needs to know that that's kind of how it is. And I thought, okay, all right, if you got to do it, you got to do it. So anyway, he did. He had to sit down with his son and told him about witches and warlocks. And Brendan said, well, I still want to be a witch. And we said, okay, good. Just wanted you to know. And so I do think that preparation is important, because sometimes people will come up and say things to you. And if you don't know, you're like, what? So, Margot, you were going to say something.
Well, I wanted to say that, Montessori parents seem to have a little bit of an edge on this, because part of the whole process is to not focus so much on gender. So you're starting at a little bit of an advantage point with those kinds of parents. I happen to have somebody in my family who, really has bought into the gender roles. And and I'm sure we all have people in our lives who are of the opinion, women shouldn't do this, that, or the other thing, or boys shouldn't do this or the other thing. So, Scott, I would be interested. I know you said we have to rely on the next generation to start neutralizing some of this language in them. But what if you run into parents or adults in the course of your contact with people who you just can't reach? Do you just kind of dismiss it and say, well, they're never going to change, they're of an age where this was never questioned or whatever, and hope that layer sort of goes away at a certain point in time? Or do you try to reach them? Because I know when I try to reach certain people, they go into this whole big, oh, you Montessorian, you're so, culty or whatever. It becomes like they put you in this whole other realm of human being. And I don't want to engage in negative, hurling back and forth. So or when you're talking about societies that are very clear about what women's roles can be and are, how do you begin in those instances of even approaching the subject without it causing all those walls to come down and close them off to the conversation?
Sure, and people do get very defensive because you're talking basically about how they act. And one of the most important issues, and obviously, is parents modeling for children. If they've got very traditional gender roles, that's probably what children are picking up in the home. There's no question, or from grandparents sometimes. And people do get very defensive. So usually coming at things directly when people are defensive is not the best approach, as you've seen. I mean, I think in my experience and from talking to others, obviously there's the modeling approach. To the extent that you are living your life, working with your children, with grandchildren, with others in a way that is aware of all this, you're setting an example, either for those other adults or certainly for the children, the young people that you're exposed to. I think the other one is if you have people you can have a dialogue with and you can have that discussion, is similar to what we were talking about before. Look around us at the qualities maybe that bother us as adults, things about gender. For example, women earn less. This is statistically incredibly well documented. There's a great tendency in meetings for men to talk over women. This has been documented very well. men to be a little bit protective of men. Men are taught from early on that to be a man means basically to dominate a conversation. That's the way they've been taught. And girls have sort of learned to be a little more submissive. If the guy is talking, they'll tend to stop. So that we know these kinds of behaviors. We know that men in general tend to be less emotional. We see that that has really negative impacts. Men do have poorer health in this country. They don't live as long. So all of that absence of emotion is not helping. There are some studies that show very concrete downsides to traditional gender roles. For example, some small studies have shown that boys who are in their parents have more traditional attitudes toward gender, they have lower reading scores, believe it or not. That is something that is transmitted to them in a way that this isn't, let's just say, manly. There are small studies also that have shown that girls who are exposed to teachers with very traditional attitudes, after 1 year, those girls exhibit different career interests. They have shifted their notions of what's expected. So, there are some very career things in our world today. Boys are getting fewer and fewer bachelor's degrees. They're picking up the notion that it's really not, I'll say manly again, to be sort of academically oriented in high school. It used to be that girls didn't achieve as well. Now, to be really academically high performing, many girls will identify with that, and boys do not. So that's a problem for boys. So we see a lot of those effects in adults, and I think sometimes people can relate when they see other adults who they know are experiencing these things. Maybe their mother or mother-in-law has been stuck in a dead-end job that's not making as much money. Well, there's probably reasons for that, and I think sometimes people can relate to that. And I'll give you one other example. Many people have children, grandchildren, are moving into colleges, and there's a lot of talk in variety of press about fraternities, date rapes, gender-based violence on college campuses. You can't read certain newspapers. It seems to go in waves before these things come up. And somebody said to me a really great expression that typifies what's happening. They said, we're training our daughters to be afraid of the men we've raised our sons to be. These boys don't come out of nowhere. All of us look at some of those reports and we're aghast. We say, how can this be? We often see behaviors reported that we wonder what's happened to these children. Well, inadvertently, while we don't like those behaviors, we've raised men to become this sort of predator when they hit a certain stage. They think that's what they're supposed to do, and girls to have another behavior. These children, these adults, these young teenagers, they didn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't happen instantly when they set foot on a college campus or in a fraternity. They're subliminally picking up these attitudes, even though parents would never think small things play into that, small things do. And I said I'd have one example, but I'll tell you one other, which is that jokes matter. People don't like to hear this, but sort of sexist or gender stereotypical jokes you'll hear among many progressive families who think that it's just a joke. But jokes matter. Jokes normalize things. And I say to people, I hate to be a sort of a downer, but find some other jokes. To have jokes about gender stereotypes and vaguely sexist jokes, which you will still hear, and you'll often hear them in children's presence. You really have to push back against it and say, I'm really not comfortable with that. Prepare yourself ahead of time of what you're going to say when you hear an expression that strikes you as not being gender equal. Prepare how you're going to handle it with an adult, because many adults struggle with that. I know parents who overhear teachers or coaches, very often it's coachings, that they'll hear with extremely gender inappropriate comments, and the parents are surprised and they don't know what to do. They feel complicit saying nothing. The coach says, don't run like a girl to her son or something like that. The parents feel complicit saying nothing, but they're not prepared. They don't know what to say. Do they deal with this head on? Do they go to it later? So, parents need to prepare for this a little bit, I feel.
So what would be an appropriate response if somebody at school would say something inappropriate? Because you also have to realize, who might be listening and
exactly
what the liability of saying anything. And in this environment, in certain environments, it could provoke somebody in a very negative response way.
Yeah, and often too, parents might be surrounded by peers that they don't want to be out front. Maybe, some might feel comfortable. I usually say two things. I say, talk to your child if you're in the presence of a child, age appropriately, of course, but address it. Hey, I heard this thing, or your teacher or your coach says this, I'm really not comfortable with that, and give them an alternative. So your child or your children, if if they're around, they know what you think, because otherwise they've heard it. You can be sure it's in the back of their heads, so it doesn't slide. And then I always say, if it's not something that you can address on the spot, you've got to go back around to it afterwards. You've got to circle around afterwards, privately, one-on-one, and and have the conversation. Here's what I heard. I'm not comfortable with that. That's really inappropriate. I don't feel that recognizes both boys and girls, whatever language you want, but you've got to circle around after it. It's an obligation, I think, for parents.
Scott, I'm so glad you made that last point. One of the things I try to impress upon parents when I do parent education is, there's a management of emotions moment in the adult and children when something comes up, and then there's a teachable moment. And sometimes I know as an adult, we react to our children's behavior with strong emotions.
Yep.
Maybe that's not a teachable moment. Whether it's talking to a child or talking to an adult about a sexist comment, it's like, am I really in an emotional state to have a serious dialogue either with a child or an adult? I think is very important. The other point I wanted to reinforce is, I know before I took Montessori training as a parent, I didn't understand that first 6 years of life is when the personality is in formation. So these little things that come out of adults' mouths, whether it's racist comments or gender comments, it's young children don't have filters. They just take it in. They're not like older people who can go, wait a minute, do I really believe that? And so I think the importance, especially with young children, of be careful what comes out of your mouth, because it's going right into their computer. You're feeding the data right in there, and it will then become part of their belief system erroneously.
And that's, of course, as you know, why other media is so important, and managing other media that children are exposed to. And that's a huge issue for parents these days, of course, and I'm sure you've done a lot on it because it's so prevalent, but that is one that I personally feel very strongly about. You can't just let all the media filter in without accepting all the biases and gender stereotypes in places where you will not see racial stereotypes or racist language. Boy, will you see gender-related issues if you start to look for it. So first, becoming a little bit aware is important, and sort of looking for some of those things, because controlling media, and when you can't control it, again, it's talking to children age appropriately, and then having that conversation. That's very important. But I do feel that is one on the gender issues. It's very clear that in film, certainly in music, even in literature, that's very important. But while I'm on the media, I know one other one that we start to see is children's association with gender and how they will select heroes or individuals that they will read about, historical teachers. So if you go into classes often, primary, elementary, where they have to select, Nelson Mandela, or whoever it is, boys at a certain age, you're going to get boys who are going to select men, by and large, with a few exceptions. Girls, it's okay. If the girl wants to pick John F. Kennedy or whatever they've heard about, male or female, they can identify with that. But for a young boy, it's much less common. They've decided that the women, are off. So a boy is not going to select a woman as a figure of, as a hero, or however it might be phrased. And you see it in selecting literature. If the main character is a girl, you're going to see boys opt out of that whole basket of literature. Girls in general are much more willing to read. It's about boys, it's about girls. So they've got this wide swath. And boys, if the girl is a main character, they've somehow picked up that doesn't relate to their life. It's very interesting.
Wow.
So can you, at home, can parents move their children without going to the extreme about things, but would it be important for the parents of boy children to say, I just want to point out that, there are these amazing women that have done things in history also. Is that what we're saying? We want parents to try to kind of move the needle at home in that way?
I think you can deal with it that way, or you can also take it upon yourself just to highlight it even more naturally. And, with things in the newspaper or things that you hear about, be aware of picking up on, in this example, women. Certainly when it comes to literature and the ages when children are still read to, which of course is a wonderful thing, parents make a point of reading to boys and girls fiction that has boy and girl main characters, or men and women main. So they're just bringing it into the home naturally. Definitely dealing with it directly. Hey, you don't hear much in the news about maybe these other people, but also to the extent that you can do it indirectly, which maybe changes a little bit the media that you're bringing in too, so that you become aware of, or the same thing with race. It's a similar kind of conversation. How you bring in characters, real or fictional, who are not part of, the white male narrative. The white male narrative is kind of the dominant one in America and in many Western cultures. And so how do you bring in more, and why we want that diversity? You could say that about gender, you could say it about race, you could say it about many things, but certainly in our culture. And I think, obviously white men should realize that's the dominant narrative at the moment. There's nothing wrong with some of those figures, but you want to sort of move that along so greater diversity gets heard from.
And I agree again, back to John's point, it's really important during those first 6 years of life, well, 3 to 6, or even younger than 3, maybe 2, when you start reading to your children in your home, you want to have a variety of books where the girl is the hero or the boy is the hero, or, and they could be fictional, they could be actual people. There are books that are written for that age that are about real people who are either male or female, who are heroes in whatever, right they have it. So I think that's really important. And if you go into a Montessori classroom, most Montessori 3 to 6 classrooms have a wide variety of kinds of books in regard to different cultures, different ethnicities, different genders, different races, all of those things. And that's why they have those, is because we want to broaden the scope for all of the children that are in the classroom and help them to understand each other better.
Scott, I have a question for you. If I were a parent who was suspecting that I might be transmitting consciously, unconsciously, some gender biases to my children, are there any tests or instruments that I can take to sort of uncover my own gender biases?
That's a good question. I don't know of a test per se, but now that you've mentioned it, I'm going to have to look it up. I definitely think there's readings for people, who genuinely do want to be more aware. A little bit is a self-education thing. We've come into all of these gender biases and stereotypes through no fault of our own. That was our culture, depending on our age group. And we definitely want to at least be more aware of them. It doesn't mean we're going to totally change, but to be more aware of the harmful ones that perhaps we don't want to perpetuate. So I don't know of an assessment per se, but I definitely would just say a little bit about becoming self-aware is the most important. And again, there's a lot in the popular literature about it. I feel for parents who want, mothers who want to identify with their daughters, or, fathers who want to identify with a son, for example, and really often then seek to perpetuate those kind of male characters, those female characteristics. And, I really try to encourage at least the parents that I talk to informally that, they're your children. You don't have to put them in those boxes to have that incredible parent-child relationship. It isn't just dependent upon this little girl, let's just say, has to be girlish, or this boy has to be prematurely uber masculine, which you still do see perpetuated, but that those parent-child relationships will be incredibly strong without that. I do think parents can be aware of some things they do, and smaller children is one. If you listen to how parents address children of different genders that they don't know, your child's friends say, and girls are often referred to as sweetie or some sort of familiar term like that, and boys are typically buddy. It's like, hey bud, that's what men will say to boys, and it's a very kind of distancing thing. And men will say to little girls that they don't know, sweetie, something like that. That's very, very common. You'll still see that's a different. People tend to comment on appearance far more for girls. You will still find people, meeting again like a child, a friend of your children or your grandchildren. And often the first comment is on appearance. Parents and grandparents want to say something nice. They want to recognize something. They don't know the child. Still, you'll get, oh, that's a lovely dress. Oh, I like your shoes. Oh, that's a pretty hairstyle. It's still typically appearance for a girl. So you're perpetuating certain things. What does that say to the girl all the time? Her appearance matters. It's very, very common. So you do still see those things. The other thing that I think parents can be aware of, we haven't talked about too much, is toys and objects and playthings, and that is incredibly stereotyped still. And we have to live in the world we live in. We don't make all of our own toys. And you still will Google search girls' toys, and I'm telling you, it's a litany of pink. And boys' toys, it's black and dark and green. Just try the search. You'll see amazing images. So that is one parents can be aware of. My children, for example, I have 2 daughters. Did they like, American Girl and dolls and that stuff? Absolutely. They also had this electronic set that I swear they wore out, plugging the thing in and building different things because they got to have both. They were exposed to both. And I think it's really important for parents to introduce those things. When they give gifts, parents will struggle. They go to the birthday party or something. What gift do I give to the little 9-year-old girl or something? And parents are so going to want to give them something that's, the arts and crafts kit. It's a 9-year-old girl. You give them arts and crafts, So I think parents can really push themselves a little bit to be more creative in that area.
God, I did think of one resource that I just came across in some anti-racist work that Task Force is doing. I believe Harvard has a set of Harvard implicit bias tests, and one of those tests is gender bias. It's called Harvard implicit bias.
Thank you. I will look it up.
If you Google it.
And actually, John, one of our participants wrote that in the question area. I was waiting for a pause.
Oh, great.
She says, Harvard bias tests are assessed online and are perfect for that.
Yep.
So great. Well, and while we're on things that with other implicit bias, many people are talking about race a little bit differently today. And there's a book, White Fragility. Some of you may have heard or read. That book was first recommended to me about gender issues. Interestingly, they said, look, this is about race, and it's about the defensiveness of whites talking about race in America. But just substitute male and female, and you will be amazed at how illustrative that is and how it changes how you think. So for anybody who has read or might be interested in reading that book, you can think about that too. And it just reinforces what we said about getting kind of other voices into the conversation.
Sure.
I'll chime in by reminding us about the work of Rianne Eisler at the Center for Partnership Studies. All of her books really address these kinds of issues, and I would highly recommend them to any parent that wants to dive deeply and try to look at a way of really thinking about a narrative that's different. The other thing that is like a whole new webcast that we haven't addressed yet is in 2007, when this thing came out, the very first websites that started making money were online pornography. And there's been a number of major stories done in the New York Times and various other media and books written about the research that's being done about the permeation by about age 10 into the lives of both boys and girls throughout the Western world of pornography and how that warps their images of what relationships are all about.
Yeah, I would agree. We haven't talked about sexuality and really, once kids are exposed to that, but the extent to people have those gender boxes and obviously pornography, to the extent that it shapes relationships and the sense of self and, and developing a healthy attitude toward others is phenomenal. There's no question.
Yeah.
Tim, I remember in Rianne Eisler's story, somebody in a workshop she was giving at one of our early conferences on the West Coast asked her, why don't they rename history as her story? And her response was, no, it's our story.
Yeah.
Lorna, I don't know, as the mediator of all of this, is there some way for you, so if people are the spelling for Rianne Eisler's name, or can I type that in
You can type
and they
it
would
in.
see it?
Yeah, you
Okay,
can type.
I'm happy to, just in case anybody is
Thanks, Mark.
interested.
I appreciate that. That's great. So participants, we have about 3 minutes left. If there's anybody out there that wants to make a comment or ask a question, we would love to hear from you. We've been talking a lot today. We've all got things to say about this particular topic. So I want to thank you, Scott, for coming today. Everything that you've shared has been really helpful and informative, and we would love to have you come back again another time. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care.
And everybody, thank you for joining us today. We'll see you again next week.